And we are live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Parsha class, Thursday Parsha class. My favorite day of the week. Let me just start with an actual public safety announcement, because I just got a city of Los Angeles alert that, I mean, this is a good announcement, that COVID vaccine appointments are becoming more widely available. They're telling us to go and check if we're eligible. So if you are eligible, just know that. And someone else, Rachel McKay Steele, I don't know if she's here today, but she said that she's seeing a lot of appointments in Carbon Health, right? So just, you know, they're out there, and if you qualify, I think it's a good time to kind of jump in before things get more and more chaotic as everybody qualifies, God willing. Okay. Well, where are we? We're in the book of Leviticus. Ooh, the book of Leviticus. Is everybody excited for the book of Leviticus? Right? Yeah. I mean, look, it's the worst book in the Torah, right? It's the most boring book in the Torah. It's like, it's awful. And it's so hard to read, and it's nobody's favorite book unless you're like really like hardcore, and then it's your favorite book because you're saying, I like punishment, I like pain, but the truth is there is a whole tradition of Leviticus is the most technical, dense, and I don't think it's the worst, or God forbid, I mean, it's part of the Torah, but it is the most difficult to read. And yet there's this whole tradition of doubling down and reading even harder, reading even closer, scrutinizing every word, even with even greater force and depth, in order to make this most difficult book come alive. And that project has been a success, I will tell you. Vayikra Rabbah, Leviticus, the great midrash on Leviticus, is one of the greatest. It's up there with Bereshit Rabbah, the great midrash on Genesis. I mean, what the rabbis did to Leviticus was just sort of like explode it and make it come alive with meaning and symbolism, and that continues on through. There are great. There are some great commentators who have really lent the whole force of their brilliance to the book of Leviticus. Samson Raphael Hirsch is a great person to read on Leviticus. And then, of course, there are modern scholarly voices that have kind of excavated for us a whole priestly world of symbolism from Leviticus. Jacob Milgram, right, being the kind of the foremost Leviticus scholar of the 20th century. So there's like, even though this book is tough, it's one of the 5 books of the Torah, and so there's no way we just ignored it. There's no way we kind of put it aside. There's no way we didn't rise to the challenge and find what it is to be a part of this tradition of Torah is to be training ourselves in the art of reading. And Leviticus forces us to read better, to read harder, to read closer, right? I had a friend once say that he loved them when we turned to Leviticus because, and this really already happens a little bit at the end of Exodus, but he said, like, once you hit Leviticus, you realize, oh, this book is about everything, you know? Like, it's not just the stories, and it's not just the religion, it's not just the creation, it's not just the beauty. We're gonna talk about everything in this book, and there's something about that that's exciting. Okay, so let's get excited for Leviticus. Let's say a blessing to begin our Torah study and to begin a new sefer of learning. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right, thanking God for Leviticus. Okay, so Leviticus is a book that is, I've said now several times, chock full of details and heavy details, gory details. It is the book, in a word, that details the sacrifices that the priests will offer in the tabernacle and then temple. So it's priestly law of how to offer sacrifices and then how to stay pure enough to be in the temple. Those are the two main topics that consume most of the book of Leviticus. But the real overarching topic of the book of Leviticus, it must be said, is holiness, creating holiness. What does it mean for something to be holy? Okay, that's Leviticus, but let's start reading now and just getting a feel for just how dense, just how detailed it is. There's a source sheet for you in the chat, and I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of what, I just want you to see what it feels like here to be reading the book of Leviticus. Emma, I'm going to need screen sharing abilities. Can you make me the co-host? Thanks. So, okay, this is how the book of Leviticus opens. And there's something grand about the opening, but very quickly we're into details. And I would even say, just to put a key word in your mind, we're into substances. Leviticus right from the start is like a recipe book. It's concerned with materials and substances. So the eternal call to Moshe, Vayikra el Moshe, Vaydaber Adonai elav me'ol moed lemor, and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any of you presents an offering of cattle to the eternal, he shall choose his offering from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall make his offering a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting for acceptance in his behalf before the eternal. That's just to give you a feel like, okay, so when we could talk a lot about what is the purpose of this sacrifice or why are we doing this all together, but just know you need to get this kind of animal, and it's, you know, the male one of the cattle or the sheep or for this kind of sacrifice. And that kind of language continues in the next chapter when we start talking about not animals, but grains. So when anyone presents a grain offering to the eternal, his offering shall be of choice flour. Okay, now you got to go get flour. Check your cabinets, right? And not only that, you shall pour oil on it. You need oil, and lay frankincense on it. Levona. You need all of these materials. This is the way that Leviticus is talking. It's talking in the language of stuff, of eye of newt and toe of frog, right? Like the stuff that makes the potion of our spiritual practice, the priestly spiritual practice. Lahavdil, I should say, right? It's not witchcraft, though that may seem. Okay, so here we are. That's just to set the stage, and we're looking at substances, and we're trying to figure out like what are the components, and maybe we are like hoping to find greater spiritual meaning somehow. What does a cow represent? What does flour represent? We can ask those questions. But when we're reading this closely in the book of Leviticus, and there's suddenly in the midst of all this detail, there's an unusual turn of phrase, an unusual line, it really like punches out at us, okay? And in chapter 2, in the 13th verse, we get more substances, but there's a phrase here that punches itself out at us. So let's take a look. Chapter 2, verse 13. You shall season your every grain offering with salt. V'chol korban minchatcha b'melach timlach. You shall not omit from your grain offering the salt of the covenant of your God. Lo tashbit melach brit Elohecha me'al minchatcha. With all your offerings, you must offer salt. Al kol korbancha takriv melach. Okay, boy, they really want salt in there, don't they? I mean, they said it 3 times in one verse. So one thing, we can do is say, why is salt so important? So let's think about that. But there was a phrase in there that was glaring, wasn't it? Anyone catch the unusual phrase?
Salt of the covenant.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's right. The salt of the covenant of your God. That is a very strange thing to say. You shall not omit from your grain offering the salt of the covenant of your God. Right? In Hebrew, it's brit, melach brit Elohecha. So, what? Does anyone what we call the pshat, just you read it and you understand what it's talking about. Does anyone understand the pshat here? Like, Wendy, you want to take a stab at this?
so immediately when I saw salt, I thought salt of the earth. And God has, the earth is God's promise to us, our life. We live on this earth. So the salt is that reminder that everything that we are living on is from God, that covenant, that promise, that agreement that we've made with God about how we're going to live on this earth.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think part of it, it's like, you know, animal, vegetable, mineral. Salt is like, in some ways, Wendy's saying, is the ultimate mineral, and therefore represents the earth itself, the stuff of this place, the inanimate, but still part of our tangible physical reality, the ground on which we stand. All right, let's just move.
Thing.
If it's very short, yes.
Okay, yes. Salt is also something that is used to preserve.
Yes, okay, that's a different idea.
Right.
Is it something about salt that is, because we know it to be a preservative? Okay, but so is it preserving the covenant? Is that what it's doing? It was like the salt there, keep it, but it seems like the salt of the covenant, not so clear. Okay, let me turn to the next hand that came up. What did I see? I think I saw one, but didn't see one. Okay, Richard Fogel.
Real quick, I can't make a connection to the covenant, but I know there's a phrase in Genesis about God separates the upper waters from the lower waters.
Yes, that's exactly where we're headed, Richard. What's the connection?
I have no idea. That's why I came to you.
Okay, fine. So Richard has heard a tale. Richard has like this, there's some legend that is circling around this verse, and Richard remembers it vaguely, right? So great, that's where we're headed. We're headed to that legend. So one more hand that was up, Alexandra.
A lot of people that who are not Jewish that I know use kosher salt specifically for like putting in the corners of rooms to purify, taking baths to purify. It's an energy thing. So is frankincense. And I think that all these laws have to do with like raising vibration and teaching like a new people how to elevate their energetic vibration to develop this closeness to God.
Great. I mean, this language of energetic vibration, right, reminds me of the spirituality that you find around crystals, people's relationship to crystals. And remember, salt crystallizes. Now, that you know, I'm not offering a Jewish perspective on that, because we could easily go the route of like, well, but that's idolatrous and that's physical. But whatever it is, there is a kind of there's something about like feeling the energy of physical objects. And I think Alexandra's saying we have to think about that with all of the elements. Salt, yes, but flour, frankincense, all of this is like, how do, imagine we say blessings over food, but this is like a more intense, like we're using food as a catalyst, as a substance, as a property that evokes certain kind of spiritual energy. Okay, all right, so that's great. I guess then one would have to ask, what about salt evokes the energy of the covenant, right? And we can think along those lines, but let's hold off for a second. I want to take us at least, Richard's already been teasing us with this legend, and I want to take us at least towards it, and by the end of our hour today, we'll fully unpack it. But before we go there, we've already had some good symbolic readings of the salt of the covenant, but I want to give us, just so we're not just totally swimming in the sea of myth, let's take a look at a much more practical, sober, reasonable, straightforward answer, and that's going to come from Shadal, Rabbi Shmuel David Lutzato, who was an Enlightenment thinker, a 19th century kind of rabbi slash scholar, meaning making like holding that line between tradition and the new Wissenschaft, the new kind of academic study of the Talmud. And Shadal offers a very like sociological, straightforward answer. And I just want us to have that, because we're soon going to toss it out and go go riding in the land of dreams. But Shadal says, the salt of the covenant of your God. We see this even today, he says, meaning back in the 19th century, that when Arab princes make a covenant, they bring a bowl of salt and eat it with bread. I mean, I don't know, that reminds me of like Shabbat and dipping the challah in salt, but he's saying something else. Like bread and salt is like and this custom of forging a covenant with salt was well known in the ancient Near East. Now, this is not my area of expertise. I don't know if anyone out there knows that this is true, or Marianka, do you have any memory or
there is a custom, for example, of welcoming guests with bread and salt in some cultures.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's right. Now that you say that, I remember that actually Melissa Balaban, right, my boss, sent me salt as one of the items of welcoming when I got to Ikar. So actually, yeah, like I hadn't thought of that, but it was okay. So there's some maybe it's because you have like the basics and you need the bait to get set up, but maybe there's something deeper about what salt means and how it. Okay, anything else? This is good. This is like the historical, sociological kind of perspective, which we can keep in mind. Okay, yeah, one more, Yonatan.
Yeah, I mean, salt does not show up a whole lot in the Torah, but we did see it, I think it was 2 parshas ago, in the anointing of the priests, right? It's one of the ingredients of the anointing oil is salt.
Yeah, where would that have been? That would have been in just in the last parsha in Pekudei?
No, I think
if you find it, will you put it in the chat for us?
Sure.
Yeah. But so then what's the connection? Just that there's something about the priestly realm that's salted, that's like spicy.
Well, I mean, you were looking for pshat connections, so there's a pshat connection. Yeah. I think there's a drash there too, which is that salt has really 2 crucial properties when it comes to food. One has already been mentioned, which is it preserves food. And the other, if you're talking about salting meat, is that it tenderizes the meat, right? It softens the meat. And that's kind of our relationship with God too, is that God preserves us when we need protection and softens us when we need, when we think too highly of ourselves.
Yeah. Okay, good. So there's lots to do here, lots of connections to make and to think about the role that salt plays in general, the role that salt plays in the Torah. Like, have we seen it before? That just the substance itself and what it symbolizes. Okay, I want to put a pause on this because I think we could keep going and then we'll kind of lose track. So let me take us to, we just saw a modern commentator, a kind of a rational commentator. Let's now fling ourselves back to the medieval period, to Rashi, who's going to give us something totally different, something wild that Richard was already remembering for us. So let's take a look at Rashi's commentary here. And we're going to spend the rest of our time kind of trying to figure out what's going on, where he got this. So Rashi says, the salt of the covenant, because a covenant was established with the salt, or with salt, it should say. Let's just change that. With salt during the 6 days of creation, when the lower waters were promised that they would be offered on the altar in the form of salt, and also in the water drawing ceremony, Nisuch HaMayim, on the Sukkot festival. Okay. Whoa. Lots of information there. So let's just talk some of this out before we start trying to figure out what he's talking about. The first thing that we need to know is that Rashi is referencing the 6 days of creation and the lower waters. In order to know what the heck he's talking about there, we have to actually go back to the second day of creation. And that's right here. Verse 6 of the Torah, right? Very early on, second day of creation. What's created on the first day? Light. And by the way, then the light is divided from darkness. That's a parenthetical to keep in mind. But on the first day, light. And then here's the second day. Vayomer Elohim yehi rakia b'toch hamayim vayim mavdil bein mayim l'mayim. God said, let there be an expanse, a rakia, in the midst of the water, that it may separate water from water. Separate water from water. God made the expanse. V'yas Elohim et harakia v'yavdel bein hamayim asher mitachat l'rakia uvein hamayim asher me'al l'rakia. Vayikain. God made the expanse and it's separated. I think God rakia v'yavdel. I don't think it's and it's separated, but maybe it's either God separated or the expanse separated. The water which was below the expanse from the water which was above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse sky. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Okay, this is very, very difficult stuff to visualize. I don't think the Torah is wanting us to even be able to visualize it because it's so mysterious. One of the first lines we read in the Torah is that the Spirit of God was hovering over the water. What? Or the waters, but by the way, the word water is almost always plural, mayim, plural, the waters. Okay, but what did we just see? We just saw that there was just like some kind of swirling water mass, and then God created a sky, or what we would think of as air, or the ether, or whatever, like the space between the waters above and the waters below. Okay. So there are waters above, and I guess, that's why rain comes down, and waters below, that's why we have oceans. Okay, like you can imagine how this fits a kind of a sense of the world around, but it's also, there's a cosmology here of like the upper waters and the lower waters. Okay, and then the other thing that we saw in the Rashi, and don't worry, I'm not gonna be talking forever, but there were a lot of details crammed in here. Okay, so there were the lower waters were promised that they would be offered on the altar in the form of salt, which I guess is like ocean salt, and also in the water drawing ceremony, Nisu Chamayim on the Sukkot festival. Now that's also a big reference point because Sukkot has this ceremony in the middle that's documented in the Mishnah, Simchat Bet HaShoeva, the water drawing ceremony. And as part of that ceremony, there's a water libation that's poured out to God. Okay, and it goes onto the altar. So I guess it also goes up to God. Okay, so let's just see. We've got like a very jam-packed kind of like kernel of a myth here, but it's very hard to understand what exactly Rashi is talking about. But Rashi says that there was a covenant that was made with the lower waters with salt, because after all, the lower waters were promised that they would be brought back up with the salt or in the water libation ceremony. Okay, all right. Let's start to try and figure this out. And I imagine at this point, it's not so accessible, but maybe someone's already got to read it. What is Rashi saying here? I think like somehow referencing the creation. Let me turn back to Richard, because Richard was the one that remembered this myth in the beginning. Richard, do you have a sense of what this means?
Yeah, it would seem that that God was saying to the lower waters, look, I'm taking the upper waters away from you, but I promise you that you'll be brought back when we do sacrifices.
Yeah.
Because you contain the salt. It's the best I can say.
That's great. That's about the best it could be said. I mean, there's something there are all these details, but somewhere in this is almost like there's like a tale being told. And it's a tale of some kind of sadness, frustration, like there's some separation that happens and someone is being consoled, one might almost say, with this promise that the lower waters is being promised that one day they'll be up again or reunited again. Okay, that's good. We're already really deep into the thick of it here. All right, David Kurtz, what do you got for us?
Well, the the ancient Near East was, especially Mesopotamian, they were really consumed with agriculture. And the difference between, of course, the ocean water and river waters, and they were between the Tigris and the Euphrates, is you need fresh water for agriculture. So by separating out the salt from the sky, we don't get salt water, we're getting fresh water. So it's almost like that's what God is, that's the gift that God is giving us, is the fresh water and separating out the salt. So one could maybe imagine that by putting the bread, by salting your food or seasoning or doing anything like that, you're kind of reminded of that perhaps gift from God.
That's great, David. That is like, I mean, that's a whole commentary onto it's a whole different interpretation that I had never considered. And in some ways, I'm just going to leave it there as a beautiful, like Shadal offered one interpretation and Rashi's offered now another. And David has another, which is that there's some cycle whereby the salted water becomes the fresh water, and then that's the covenant. There's a whole different narrative there, that God gives us fresh water somehow by extracting salt, right? That's quite striking. I like that. It's a different direction to go, but I love it. Jen Snow?
To me, it seems like the salt is so elemental and so almost like it's just so essential that it's not, it feels almost like the separation happens only in the service of reuniting them. Like if you're saying that the salt, I haven't thought this through entirely, but it feels like the salt is so just essential and basic and elemental that the separation, it's not necessarily saying that the lower was bad and the upper was good. They're two parts of the same thing.
Yeah. Right.
I
think that is part of the question we're asking here as we begin to narrate this, to give it kind of character, as if there are characters in our story. Some question here around whether the lower waters were lower, and that's part of the problem, or is the problem the separation itself? Right? Now, here's like where things get really interesting. Just from a matter of text, from the perspective of textual investigation, which is Rashi gives us this story. Nobody knows where he gets it. Rashi's always quoting some earlier midrash, but we don't have that midrash. And this happens sometimes. We don't have a midrash where is Rashi getting this idea? Now, here's a midrash that we do have, the closest thing that we have to what Rashi is talking about. And it's this right here. In Genesis Rabbah, Rabbi Berechia said, when the lower waters were separated, they were weeping. In fact, in Hebrew, it's even better. Lo pershu hamayim atachtonim min ha'elyonim ela bivchia. They wouldn't be separated without a great crying. And then this is not really an exact connection, but in Job, it says God dams up the sources of the stream. And so the sources, mibchi, is not related actually, but sounds like the word for crying. So that's rabbinic technique. They always want to have a verse they can hang their hats on. But verse aside, there's some image here that I think echoes what Jen was saying, that when the waters were ripped apart, they were crying. They were crying because there's something about the separation that was painful for them, right? And that could be, now, why would that be? Why would that be? Matt Silverstein.
Okay, I'm responding to before that, not to this latest. If we accept that the salt is invoking the waters and doing that, and I think I was going to quote that Job passage, but water is the primeval chaos. and is this dangerous force. And the salt of the covenant original first is that God is holding back the water. In Job, he talks about you have dammed up the water that is going to flood. In the Noah flood, the water is going to come down and destroy, and it echoes God's role, God's promise to us, God's covenant to hold that back, to keep the world as it is and not let it return to primal chaos.
Good. So Matt is giving us yet another lens through which to look at this kind of like water imagery in the early, especially in the early parts of the Torah, which is that this is a theory among scholars of the ancient Near East that a lot of cultures had flood narratives, and that from the floods that they experienced, there was a sense that maybe water was like a dangerous force, and maybe once water had taken over everything, and God was the one who cleared space for us to be. And so there's always a worry that the waters will come rushing back and that we'll be enveloped once again in a flood. But the flood ends up being like, imagine all of existence was just, we're just underwater. It's amazing that there's air at all. And that the Torah is in its creation story saying, no, God like is making space for us, right? So, but then things get like, okay, so that's out there. That's a notion that we might play with as well. But things get confusing because the water doesn't want to be separated in this story. The water wants to be back with the water, but we, if Matt is right, we do want the water separate because the alternative is what did you call it? Primeval chaos, right? So yeah. Okay, so then is there some tension between? And I think this is what we ought to take away from the thoughts that Matt offers us. Is there some tension between the water's desires and our desires, and how do we negotiate that tension? How do we manage the water? Okay,
and that's a covenant. And that's an agreement. That's
right.
There's
water's agreed to back up so we could be. That's a nice way of putting it. The water's agreed to back up so that we could exist, but the water's like, wait a minute though, we gotta think about us. There's gotta be some mechanism for getting back. Okay. Have I said, I think what I haven't talked about is enough is the water drawing ceremony, right? That was referenced there. Okay, the offerings are salted, and then the salt goes up to God, and then somehow as the salt goes up to God, the lower water's returning to the upper. But the water drawing ceremony, I said, it happens on Sukkot. It was a big, wild deal. In the last chapter of the Talmudic tractate on Sukkot, there's a discussion of the water drawing ceremony, and the rabbis say, anyone who kol shelo ra'ah simchat beit hashuvah. If you never saw the water drawing ceremony, lo ra'ah simcha b'chayav. You never saw happiness in your life. That was true joy, and they described rabbis with torches, dancing, right? Like there's like a great concern that like there's going to be too much frolicking and sexuality. Like it's a party, and the party is around like hooray for water, and that's because on some basic level, and I think we have to say this, that's because we need water. It's the most vital substance after air for us. Like when we think of our work, we need water, right? So there's kind of a celebration there, but this legend works that celebration into the reunification. Like as we pour that water onto the mizbeach, the altar, we're happy about water, but it's happy because it's going back up to its partner, right? And it really does seem like partner language. That there's an upper and a lower water, and they're like lovers who have been torn apart. Right? Okay. So let's keep playing with that imagery. Joni Brenner.
Thank you, Rabbi. I wanted to say, you know, we just came from the Red Sea, and what that's all made of. But I think of water, Mayim Chaim, is very joyous. It's the unification, irrespective of who is laying next to one another. There's a fluid exchange, which I find very, very erotic and very, very exciting. And there was one more thing, the salt of your God, to me, that, because I was just studying the Slonim Rebbe. And so the question is, where are we in the story? And I think for me, the salt of your God is how do I show up? What is my essential place that I am offering at the altar and in this relationship? Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Joni, you've just given us so much layering there. And Joni is exactly right. It's amazing. This group is so amazing that we can move from like Matt's cultural anthropology in one comment to like Joni's Kabbalah in the second, which is to say that Joni is also reminding us of a kind of a well-established stream of interpretation, and it is the mystical stream. You'll see this a lot in the Zohar, that they speak about the upper waters and the lower waters, right? And obviously it's a reference to this same passage in Genesis, but in the language of the mystics, there is an erotic charge to it, right? Like the upper being usually male and the lower being female. And I think that in part, I mean, there's a hierarchy there, but I think it's also because of they're imagining missionary sex and their waters, right? It's an exchange of fluids, right? There's the upper fluids and the lower fluids. And that's, look, that's not my doing. Jewish mysticism has a strong erotic streak or charge to it. But that's erotic is one word for it. Desire and longing and intimacy is another. And when we're talking about the waters being separated and crying, it's like, with Joni's language, it's like they're being separated from their lover. And almost in the act of intimacy, they're being ripped apart. So now the lower waters and the upper waters long for one another, right? And our job, like, what's our job? Joni asks. What role do we play in uniting these lost lovers? Right? Like, think about that now. Now, right? We're in Leviticus, remember? But in Leviticus, now suddenly we're reorchestrating a kind of cosmic, erotic, romantic drama. Okay, like let's just take note of where we've gotten, how grand we've gotten. Okay, Regina.
I see it a little bit regarding current times. You know, we're always in a search for equilibrium, you know, having a balance of salt and then the unsalted water. And I think in current times we are crying out because we're losing water. You know, we're doing desalinization because we're afraid of not having enough water. Worried about droughts right now. So I think we are having a crying out route right now. And,
Yeah, you know, and I think that link that you're making for us, Regina, between our thirst for water, just as a basic source of life, and the kind of thirsty longing of lovers imagery I think those things are related. That is, I think it's because of the desperation that we feel around water that it just becomes this substance that carries so much, the stakes are so high with it, right? Okay, can I turn to Arlene Bernstein? Sorry to startle you there.
Yeah, well, I've got the plot Torah commentary, and they were saying about salt was what you were saying too, but the idea that the lower waters were totally separated from God, which is that, God was, let's say, in the heavens. So God said to them, don't worry, I'll sanctify you, like in these ceremonies with salt, purity. So to me, it's sort of interesting because it ties into everything. It ties into it ties into the, the love, what you were saying, but sanctification, it ties into purity, it ties into so much of the reason. And I think maybe visually, it was the idea of people having a connection to God, because at that time you've had the priest or the Roman emperors that were gods. So here you are, that you can take salt, which anybody can do. It's in the ground, so you can be poor. So everyone is able to do this, and it comes from God, and it comes from the creation and the whole story. So you're actually being part of the creation. So
Okay, excellent.
With
Excellent.
the prayers, and that's the connection.
Excellent, Arlene. That's such an important. Thanks for reminding us, and in a sense, forcing us to pause a little bit, because here we are kind of racing down the track of the upper and the lower, and they long for each other and they cry for each other, and they're somehow sexually united. And it's like, this is like, whoa, what's going on here? But wait a minute, there are other themes, there are other elements in this imagery. And one of them is there's offering, there's the desire to be close to God. And that's not just, another form of longing, erotic desire. There's something about it that's meant to be pure and holy and elevated. That's also part of how do we sanctify this longing? How do we sanctify ourselves? Isn't there all this priestly stuff going on here? So with that reminder, right? Like how do we deal with the water as characters, but also think about the context of the priestly rites that we're conducting them through? Take a look now. I told you there's no source for this Rashi. We don't have the source for this Rashi, right? And I showed you a midrash that's sort of similar, but not what Rashi's saying. So there's a book called the Torah Shlema, and I'm fond of it. It's a collection of midrashim. It's a massive collection of midrash. This is just one volume. I'm fond of it, especially because it was compiled by Rabbi Menachem Mendel Kasher, right? And I don't know if I'm related to him. I don't think I am, but I really wish I was, because it's just a masterpiece. But he has in here, he has the original source. He found it. No, but he didn't find it. He didn't find it at all. What he says, usually he's quoting these midrashim, but in this one he says, look, Rashi quotes this source, the Ramban quotes this source. We see this source everywhere. It definitely existed. And this is his reconstruction of the midrash. Okay, so this is sort of like an exciting moment in, like reconstructive Judaism, right? Like reconstructionism. This is the midrash as it has been cobbled together from various sources. Okay, so here's the Torah Shlema giving us his best sense of what was that original story, and it's just another version of this that I think has some of the elements that Arlene was just reminding us of, elements of purity, elevation, godliness. So let's take a look at how it appears in the Torah Shlema. Okay. This is slightly different, right? We just read that they were crying, they love each other, they want to be together. This is a little different. When the lower waters were divided from the upper, they screamed, weeping, that they would be stuck in a place of impurity. Sheyu b'makom tumah, lower, not higher. The Holy Blessed One said to them, if you will be quiet, stop crying, then I will command them to perform the water drawing ceremony. You'll go up in that water. Now listen to this. But they would not be appeased, because they said, that's only once a year. You kidding me? That you're going to separate me, you keep me down here in the lower realms, and they only get to go up in one little vase once a year. So the Holy One made a covenant with them with the offerings that would be salted. As it said, with all your offerings, you must offer salt. Do not leave out the salt. Okay, and then look, usually he tells you what midrash it's from, but he just says here, midrash. It's a midrash. We don't know where it comes from, but that's the story. That's the original story. That's the one that Rashi was drawing from. So that's a little different, isn't it? It's a little different. The lower waters are stuck in a place of impurity and they want to go back up. That's a different drama, slightly, and we have a different role in that drama, right? So what is our role in assisting with this promise that was made to the lower waters? Okay, let me circle back around to Hannah Jensen. By the way, new. If you haven't spoken before, you jump straight to the front of the line. So just, I'd love to hear from as many people as possible. Hannah Jensen.
Hi. Okay. So this is not really probably useful. I don't know, but this reminds me a lot of the midrash that I don't know where it is, but you can tell me about the moon and the sun. And there's this midrash that the moon was very unhappy because the sun became the bigger of the two lights, and the moon complained to God that, why is it that you said you made two great lights, but we can't both be great lights? And so God says, okay, you complained, so now I'm going to make the sun the greater of the two lights. And then the moon complains again, essentially, and says that, but wait, that doesn't seem fair. I was just expressing myself and now I'm being diminished for that. And so then God says, okay, well, but I'll give you two things for that. One, you'll still exist during the day, but you'll mostly rule over the night. And also you'll be with the calendar. We'll go by the calendar and we'll have Rosh Chodesh and you'll have this really important role. Is that
That's
sort of
exactly right? Okay. That's exactly right.
Okay. So
the moon complains, how can there be two great lights, right? The Genesis says and God created the two great lights. The moon says, how can there be two great lights? And God, in almost like a nasty comeback, says, oh, you want there to be two? You think there's not enough room for two? You can be the small one, right? So
exactly.
Yeah.
But then God understands that God has erred, that that actually God fell short in that moment. And so then God says, okay, well, you can have something else. You can have the night. You can also exist during the day and be sort of visible. And also you can have Rosh Chodesh, and that's really this powerful thing. And also Rosh Chodesh, as we know, is the first commandment that we get as a Jewish people. And so I think it's just making me think about that. And I feel like, to answer your question in some way about what's our role in this, our role is to make some kind of offering that involves salt as a way to be part of the reparations for that, in the same way that we're obligated to do Rosh Chodesh in reverence to the moon and in acknowledgement of the way that diminishment also happened, and there's some attempt to repair.
Okay.
So that's what I'm thinking.
Now we're getting somewhere just massive. Okay, let's just take in the magnitude of what Hannah just said. So Hannah reminds us that there is similar mythology around the sun and moon and the way that the light was separated. Remember, the light itself was divided into dark and light. And then the sun and the moon. There's another midrash about the Leviathan and how the male and female Leviathan were separated and weren't allowed to mate, right? And then, of course, let's remember that there's another midrash that Adam, the human, was separated into two halves, right? That were longing for one another, right? So it is as if something is happening in creation itself that is a dividing. It's one of the first verbs that the Torah uses. And then the Torah uses it all through the creation. And God divided, and God divided, and God divided. Before that, it was all one. Call it the primeval chaos, or just call it God's unity, but it was all one. But then there was division. And everything, and that had to be, I suppose, in order for there to be a world at all. But everything that has been divided, including us, longs for its other half, longs to be reunited. And here Hannah begins to suggest, and I want to hear you all pick up on this, our job is to facilitate that unification, to help reunite the forces which have been divided in the world. And that is why the Kabbalists began their performance of every mitzvah with Lishem Yichud Kudshabrichu Ushchinte, for the sake of the unification of God with God's presence, the male and female aspects of God. Right? So everything is divided into these like yin yang categories, and everything's longing to be back together again. And part of our job is to bring things back together again. Okay, Kathy Kobayashi, what do you have to say about this? Kathy, you're muted. Kathy's our resident expert in Genesis and the Garden of Eden.
No, but I was going to say that I think I really like that construction, that our job, or one of our jobs, is to reunite. But it's also, seems to me, really, really clear that one of our jobs is to make the distinctions. It's like the morning blessings. I mean, it's making distinctions that we're, that's constantly what we're supposed to be doing. And we're grateful that we can make those distinctions, and that, the daily blessing on, I guess, on wisdom or intelligence, the one at the beginning,
right.
That all about our so
for the mind to be able to determine the difference between light and dark, right? Yeah. Which we do at Havdalah every week also. Yeah.
Right. So that, I don't think that takes away from what you were saying, that our job is also to reunite, but it's definitely distinguish as well. So.
Right. Great. In other words, there's a kind of a tension, and it's very abstract, but in some ways it's core Jewish theology. There's a tension between unity, oneness, and distinction. And the tension lies in the fact that God has to create something other than God's self in order for there to be a world at all. And this echoes Matt's suggestion that God has to create space, but God has to create distinction. God has to create variety. The whole point of creation is from the one to the manifold, right? But in the very act of creation, we lose a sense of God. God becomes obscured by it because God is oneness. So we, as carriers of this tradition, are reminding ourselves of the oneness, even as we participate in the act of being in this world, of creating, of distinguishing, of knowing the difference between dark and light and good and evil, and right, like, and the upper and the lower. So that's a difficult kind of theological position to hold. All is one or should be one, but isn't really, and we have to know the differences, right? So, what do we do with that? Okay, let me turn back to some of our early commentators. Wendy Becker.
This is many things that come to mind about waters. First of all, you're talking about separation. Separation is sanctification. It's a necessity in the world that we live in. And that dichotomy of desiring the oneness, and yet the fact of the matter, our uniqueness, is extremely important. And discovering who we are, who our unique neshama is, each one of us, is an extremely important part of our work in the world. And when I think of water, we are—
Can I jump in, Wendy? Because what you just said, I think, is important. What I was just talking about, like distinction and unity, and it all sounds very abstract. But Wendy brings us to what's at stake, which is that in order for us to exist, we have to be apart from God. That's the whole idea, is that we are other than. So our sense of self, our individual, our existence depends on division. And yet the fundamental nature of reality is unity. So we're trying to preserve, using SALT language, trying to preserve our being, our sense of separateness. In order to be in relation, we have to be other. And that's important. Thanks, yeah. Wendy. Continue, please.
So, and that's a necessity in any relationship. And when we're talking about the eroticism, the upper and the lower waters. Also, when you're dealing with that, we're dealing with our love of God. There's that yadid nefesh, that necessity that in our relationships, it's a reflection of our relationship with God. But and water has such a very powerful part of our existence because we're made of water. And water is also something that's cleansing. Water is transformative. This is why we using water can literally transform us. Scientifically, you take a shower and it changes things about you. So this
is good. This is full circle in some ways, because now we're back to thinking about, well, but why water and why salt? Right? The questions we're in this like massive cosmic drama now, but why water and why salt? And part of the reason is all of the things we said at the outset, all of the ways these are primary. Of course, we're working out our sense of our place in the world and our wonderings about like the great chaotic forces in the world. Of course, we're working them out with the most basic elements, the very things that you would need in your house. If you were just starting, the primary things, those are going to be the substances, the media through which we conduct our kind of spiritual exploration of our place in the world. Okay, I want to just
Can I just do one last little bit, because this is the one thing that came to me. The unification of the water and salt is something that we have, and we display when we cry. Our tears are salt and water, and that expression from our being, from our emotion, from our heart, that comes out physically.
That there's got to be some connection there, right? If the waters are separated in tears, and tears are made of salt water, and we're talking about salt and water, and right, so there's something. It's more elemental than just what you would have in your house. It's like the elements that emerge from your own body at your moments of separation, right? That is indeed a beautiful thought there, that we are somehow reenacting the covenant of salt every time we cry ourselves. What a thought. What a thought. All right, I can think of no better way I don't know where to close all this, because it's just so wild and sprawling, but I'd like to close with, we looked last week at the commentary of the Maharal of Prague, the Gur Aryeh. He's a commentator on Rashi and always takes Rashi and brings it to the philosophy. Rashi's kind of like beautiful, intricate mythology. The Maharal brings into sort of philosophical, and this is what he says about what he learns from this tale that we've been examining. He says, and he's also talking about this midrash that nobody knows where to find, but he says that there is in this midrash a great secret. For everything always wants to be raised up. Shekol dvarim tamidem holchim lehalot. As it says in the Talmud, malim b'kodesh ve'en moridim. We increase in holiness and we don't go down. So when the lower waters were separated from the upper waters and turned into low things, this was the opposite of the order of creation and existence, where everything is always longing to be raised. Therefore, they refused to be divided until God promised them that they would be offered on the altar and finally achieve elevation. And this is another language for us to use. We talk about maybe, we can talk about, following Hannah, our role in kind of reuniting creation, bringing torn apart lovers of creation back together. Something beautiful about our role in that. But here's another vision, which is that our job is to elevate. Everything is longing for elevation, and when our whole religious lives are about elevate, and that makes some sense after all of the strange ritual of the sacrifices altogether, which is to take this material in its most basic form, to take this material world and to turn it into spirit so that it rises, right? So that's our job, okay? So I charge you with that in the week to come. I got to close here, but good learning with you all today. Oh, well, you know what? I'm going to close with my mom. No, she just wanted to say hi. Okay, I always want to give my mom the last word if I can. All right, love you all. Love you, Mom. Bye. I should also say, I guess, that there's we're having a gathering this evening at 6 p.m. Just to as a kind of show of solidarity with the Asian American community that has been experiencing a spate of violent attacks over this past year that's been building, especially recently. So we're having a gathering that you can find on our calendar at 6 p.m. And so that I should mention. I also should mention that at 7, we're doing a Haggadah on a totally different spirit, a Haggadah slam, a kind of 3 synagogues in our area are doing a kind of Torah on the Haggadah. So there's a couple of important programs later this evening that you may want to check out. Take a look at our website and our calendar. Okay, bye.